Well, the World Economic Forum's 2023 Global Risk Report emphasizes that energy is crucial for supply chain resilience. Now, it notes that energy supply shortages have also seen a number of countries going back to burning coal, thereby reneging on the carbon reduction commitments. The report cautions on a number of compounded global risks which could result in a global economic downturn, social unrest, food insecurity, and natural disasters resulting from climate adaptation failures. Well, for more on this, we are joined now via Zoom by Liberty Lead Specialist Zandile Makhoba. Great to have you. Thanks very, very much for joining us on the program, Zandile.
Thank you for having me.
Just from speaking about the introduction of this global risk report that was released, it seems that we're in for a very difficult time ahead. There are a lot of threats about us. I mean, we already have been through tough times when we look back to the start of 2020 and now going beyond. It looks like there's a lot. But perhaps you want to talk to us about what really stands out in this report for you.
So definitely, I think from the cost of living crisis is very clear, and the report itself already says that we're already in it. It becomes part of not just the short-term threats, but also the long-term threats that we face as a globe. So it's a world problem now. It's no longer an African problem. But one of the things that really comes out quite strong for me in the report is how environmental concerns are really core in both the long and short-term risks. So if we look at the top 10 risks for the short term, which is the next 2 years, 5 out of those 10 are related to climate change and environmental issues. And in the long-term trend as well, it sits at around 6 out of the top 10 risks that the world is going to face. That in itself exacerbates all the other concerns that we have from a social, economic, geopolitical element, because in trying to mitigate the impact of some of these environmental issues, we then start to take on policies and changes that don't necessarily make things better in terms of how governments work. So it's very interesting how we navigate this one, because it's also one of the factors that we can do very little about as a human race. You know, what nature decides to do is almost always out of nature. And as much as we can do a lot to try and mitigate things like global warming, we are probably going to see these move faster than our interventions can take. Yeah. A lot of countries and governments are not prepared for what may come with big disasters, and we've seen that in our own economy as well.
Well, we certainly are. And I mean, if we could just, look at where we're sitting right now, is that obviously we're talking about the whole issue of climate change, which I know is probably one of the most important things we have to look at. But at the same time, when we are living in the now, and you and I are both sitting in stage 6 load shedding, and people are in the darkness, we're having huge problems when it comes to electricity and what we're doing about this power crisis. We're trying to move away from coal, and yet coal is in such big demand, and other European countries that are insisting that we move away from it are buying it up at a rate that the world can't keep up with it. But now, where does that leave us? Because we know that we are not the biggest emitter of all of this and the climate change that we're seeing, and yet we're asked to take huge risks on behalf of the economy and the people of the continent because it's the right thing to do, and we know that. But can we really afford that?
And it's a real challenge, I think, for governments, in the sense that you are dealing with very difficult trade-offs. So just to highlight, in terms of the top 10 short-term risks, is this cost of living crisis, which is related to, shortages in energy supply, rising costs of fuel and food prices, access to shelter. All of those things are really making it hard for people to live. So do you deal with a long-term risk and something that we possibly can't do much about at the expense of something like making sure that energy is available for people, the economy becomes stable, and people are creating jobs. So we are facing those tensions and those trade-offs, and in doing that, the report itself also talks a lot about polycrisis, where we start to see multiple layers of risks collectively combining to create a compounded risk, where we do see environmental issues happening at the same time as, cost of living crisis, and that in itself just making it so much more difficult for us to do anything about. Where fiscal and monetary policy become less effective, and decisions made by other countries that we trade with and do business with will do what they need to do to protect themselves. So it becomes a very challenging time and a very important time for the globe itself to begin to have better conversations with ourselves, sitting around the table and having very humanitarian conversations, which is definitely very challenging now, where deglobalization is starting to happen. Lots of concern about our citizens and what that might mean for trade and those relations that we might have.
Yeah, I mean, it is frightening to read about. I think one of the biggest issues we have. I mean, we've spoken to the energy and the climate crisis, which we're in, and I know that this is always the big talking point. It feels like it is one that will constantly be there until, of course, goals are met, if they ever are met. But it is something that needs to be spoken about dramatically. But people's livelihoods right now and the cost of living, the fact that the access to food is one of the greatest challenges. You have some countries that have got everything, and you've got others that have got nothing. You've got people in countries that go to bed, they have not eaten a thing all day. And, this is where you see leaders coming together to have this talk shop, and yet really at the heart of all of it is the suffering of people. And whatever happens, because I feel like we talk about this every single year, and we pin our hopes on the World Economic Forum and these leaders coming together, and big differences will be made. And yet here we are a year later, literally talking about the same things, if not in a worse position than we were last year. What do we actually ever see coming out of these World Economic Forum gatherings?
I think it's still very important to have these discussions. So, and one of the big risks, and I think which is a big concern, especially for the African continent, is also this rise of involuntary migration. So I think we've seen that even in our own South African context, where we have a lot of different nationalities moving into South Africa for opportunities and, just safety and security, and how that boils into new tensions, the development of xenophobia. So we're in a space of fighting for resources, but also we are seeing that the decisions we make as countries definitely we are not immune to what happens to our neighbors, to various countries on the continent. And this is something of a global scale, which makes it important for us to have these conversations. What is also really worrying is that a lot of the tension that we see, geopolitical conflict, for example, means that governments themselves are a big cause of some of the crises that we do see. And it's difficult to see these conversations happen every year, but it's absolutely critical, because without those conversations, we will not be able to act in a coordinated manner as countries, as NGOs and the like, to actually make sure that these things come out much better. One of the other big issues that also comes out is this polarization of societies, which we've also seen, where, income differences and inequalities do create more tensions within society. So we're starting to see that grow. And in many countries, the political system and political parties are very much a big cause of those changes that we see, that then create problems for other countries. So as difficult as it is to see these conversations happen, we do also see resolutions come out of these and the implementation of new ways of doing things. So it's a slow process, but I think it's one that definitely is worth doing, and that does produce results.
Africa's role in all of this, and let's talk about it, because I'm sort of digging deep and having a look at where Africa stands in the whole equation. And when we talk about the World Economic Forum, and we know that we do have a big presence there, you know, there's so much talk and articles coming out saying, you know, not South Africa, but Africa has the potential to feed the world. And when we talk about agriculture, and that is something that we should be tapping into and working more. We know this. These are things that have been spoken about, and we do understand the resources and the wealth that the African continent has. Yet, when it comes to leadership, we have a huge problem, and that's one of the biggest problems that hinders the continent from moving forward. But this issue about people looking for food, people starving at this point in time, but Africa being the key to perhaps solving that crisis. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Where do we come into the equation? Where do we turn the tide in terms of Africa's role in this world?
I think there's really a lot that would still need to happen for us to be able to play this role. It's one thing to talk about the potential that the country has. But with all these resources, we're still one of the continents that suffer the most, that deal with the highest levels of poverty, limited access. And we're now at a place where, you know, the food crisis is not just a local phenomenon or an African problem. It's something that the whole world and some of the most developed countries in the world are becoming concerned about. And maybe that makes, you know, the developed world a little bit more focused and interested in making sure that Africa flourishes in this direction. But definitely, it's a conversation that is bigger than our leaders on the continent. It's one that is worth having with various parts of the world, and starting to see ways of reinvesting and regrowing the potential that exists on the continent. From an African perspective, one of the biggest risks that we face, and that is highlighted in this report, is the debt crisis, where, you know, we've gone into a lot of sovereign debt, trying to fix issues of the past. More recently, it's dealing with the crisis that COVID-19 has brought to the continent, and that in itself is one of the big challenges of just being able to invest further. So while we deal with debt, it leaves very little room for solid investment going forward. But we also do see that foreign direct investment doesn't necessarily wait for complete stability in economies and political systems. With the right environment set in place for investors to plow in and be able to get returns from those investments, they will do that. And it's really about us on the continent talking about how we can enable investment to actually do what it needs to do. And this is not just for the security of us as a people on the continent, but it becomes a conversation about making available resources to the rest of the world, where we are seeing a lot of new challenges developing.
Just, I want to pick your brain very quickly as we sort of start to wrap up the interview. Yes, we see the global risks, but we also do know that South Africa is going. The president will be representing the country. He will be there alongside, I'm sure, a host of other ministers and business leaders that will accompany him. And yet, we are attending the World Economic Forum at a time where there is a real risk of the collapse of much of our state infrastructure. And that is one of our biggest problems. You know, we go into this World Economic Forum trying to attract investment, trying to gain the confidence and the globe, and yet, when you look at what is happening in this country, it is of great concern. And I don't imagine that the world have blinkers on when they look into what is happening here in South Africa. How do we save, the infrastructure that we are currently seeing crumbling right before our eyes, and be the image of a country that we do, whether we like it or not, need international investment in a country to see it prosper even more? But the reality is that who would put their money into a country that literally has, I mean, as we sit now, perhaps 10, 11, 12 hours of darkness in a day? It's no electricity. How do businesses work and operate? The president has a very big mission ahead of him to try and to try and find people to invest in this country?
So, yeah, what's also really highlighted in the report itself is one of the countries that sees state collapse as one of the biggest risks is South Africa. I think we are one of only 3 countries that has ranked state collapse as one of the biggest issues. So just remembering that the people interviewed and the participants of this research are business leaders, academics, and they are saying that this is the crisis we face. So with our infrastructure already crumbling, challenges in the political system, it's definitely a huge risk for the president and a huge challenge for him to face. But we are now in a space where we have so much to lose, particularly the private sector itself, as a big stakeholder in the stability of South Africa as an economy and as a country. And there is more at stake than just, we're kind of not in a space where we can just relax and not be interested in what happens. There's more at stake for those who are already invested, and protecting that investment is critical. So I think we see a lot more just coming out of the business world in terms of showing a willingness to support and create stability in the South African context, and supporting the public sector in terms of some of the challenges that we do face, so that we collectively have something to protect and definitely start to find solutions for some of our big challenges, like the energy crisis.
Indeed. All right, we'll have to leave it there. Liberty Lead Specialist Zandile Makhoba, thank you for talking to us here on the program. And this is talking ahead of the World Economic Forum's 2023 gathering. This was the Global Risk Report that was released yesterday. And just to give you a more, Zandile, thank you very, very much for your time. So just to give you a bit more on the issue we were talking about and Zandile alluded to, this was a survey that came out yesterday. In fact, it's questions that are asked to a lot of the business specialists that look into the countries that they are representing. And South Africa, the biggest risk that South African businesses that are being represented there are saying is that they are worried about the total collapse of services in the country and public infrastructure. They, alongside Bosnia and Herzegovina and Peru, are the 3 countries that are worrying about state collapse. So that's something to really think about, South Africa, as we head into 2023. That is the biggest risk that people are fearing right now, is a total collapse of the state. It's a big worry. I mean, before this, I think it was last year, they were generally worried about the global economy and growth of global economy, but now it's more specialized into what is actually happening between these borders, and a great worry from companies.